So right in the first two scenes, we see questions about the justification of war. It seems like it's all backroom politics, not some sort of glorious cause. Another scene that the skeptical interpreters will point to is Act 2, Scene 3. So in Act 2, Scene 3, we have the reference to the death of Falstaff. And this was another source beginning right from Gould in 1919 of a sense of the irony that undercuts the play. So it, on the face of it, we're supposed to celebrate achievements of Henry V, but there's this subtle undercurrent of what's being silenced in this. You know, the Falstaff that was such a popular character, the most popular character in Elizabethan theater in part 1 and part 2 of Henry IV. And in the second part of Henry IV, Shakespeare at the end, he promises to bring back Falstaff. So he's such a big hit, right? You know, you have to bring him back in another sequel. But it's a promise he fails to deliver. We don't see Falstaff in the play. He's only referred to in passing. And Falstaff he's off stage and he dies, and there's a sense that he dies because of the rejection he received from Hal in the second part of Henry IV. So after Falstaff's boy reports that his master is very sick, the hostess declares that the king has killed his heart. This is Act 2, Scene 1. And then Nym concurs in saying that Henry's rejection turned Falstaff melancholy. He says, the king hath run bad humors on the night. So I alluded to the notion that we could see in this maybe a parallel to the death of Socrates. So I want to remind ourselves of the death of Socrates as portrayed in this Platonic dialogue called the Phaedo. So the Phaedo, well, the apology for Socrates presents Socrates' defense speech. He's on trial and the community's there, and his defense speech to the jury. He's on trial for bringing in strange gods to the city, for corrupting the youth through his questioning of the standards of the community. So the apology presents that defense speech. He's found guilty and sentenced to death. The Phaedo represents this dialogue that takes place in prison as he awaits his death sentence. He gets finally towards the end of that dialogue, he takes the drink of hemlock in a famous scene as presented here visually much later in the 18th century by Jacques-Louis David. This Death of Socrates, I've always really loved this painting. So in the Phaedo, we get this description of the death of Socrates. He's just drunk the hemlock. The prison guard who's administered this hemlock is checking Falstaff, and this poison is slowly working on him. The man who gave him the poison now and then looked at his feet and legs, and after a while he pressed his foot hard and asked him if he could feel, and he said no, and then his leg, and so upwards and upwards, and showed us that he was cold and stiff. And he felt them himself and said, when the poison reaches the heart, that will be the end. He was beginning to grow cold about the groin when he uncovered his face, for he had covered himself up, and said, they were his last words. He said, Crito, I owe a cock to Asclepius. Will you remember to pay the debt? So these are the last words of Socrates, and he has this poison that's taking effect, and part of the effect is this growing numbness that goes up and up his leg, up to his groin. Now compare this with the hostess reporting the death of Falstaff in Act 2, Scene 3. Nay, sure he's not in hell. He's in Arthur's bosom. If ever man went to Arthur's bosom. So this is kind of a little joke because she's mixing up Arthur with Abraham. She should have said in Abraham's bosom. So she's mixing up, let us say, like a pagan secular reference to King Arthur, to obviously a biblical and religious reference to Abraham. He made a finer end and went away, and it had been any chrisom child. He parted even just between 12 and 1, even at the turning of the tide. For after I saw him fumble with the sheets and play with flowers and smile upon his finger's end, I knew there was but one way, for his nose was as sharp as a pen, and he talked of green fields. How now, Sir John, quoth I, what man be a good cheer? So he cried out, God, 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 3 or 4 times. Now I, to comfort him, bid him he should not think of God. I hoped there was no need to trouble himself with any such thoughts yet. So he bade me lay more clothes on his feet. I put my hand into the bed and felt them, and they were as cold as any stone. Then I felt to his knees, and so upward, and all was as cold as any stone. So again, we have a very parallel scene with her feeling up his leg, and they're cold and numb, just like Socrates' legs. Here played with more of a sly reference to an almost sexual act on part of the mistress. The other thing I'd point out is that the mistress quickly wants to divert his attention away from God. He's on his deathbed here, and she can tell this, and he's crying out to God. Now, and if anything, I guess you'd want to comfort the person and allow them to have their last confession, their last connection with the divinity, whatever one regards that to be, as they have their fleeting moments on this earth. She wants to kind of stop that, and it's not necessarily the best approach at a person's deathbed, so to speak. So the other thing I'll point to is the Falstaff's fumbling with the sheets and played with flowers and smiled as if he had things at his fingers, but he's picking these flowers that are on the sheets, or at least in his mind, and picking them up and holding them in his hand. And a case has been made that this is kind of an advanced onset of kind of alcohol-induced or alcoholism-induced delusions, and that the whole scene seems to describe what could happen in advanced death of an alcoholic. So we have this scene of Falstaff being compared loosely to the death of Socrates. So why does Shakespeare want us to make this connection? I'll point out that Falstaff's resemblance to Socrates was alluded to in the earlier plays. So Harry calls him, quote, that villainous, abominable misleader of youth, that old white-bearded Satan. And we recall that the charges brought against Socrates at his trial in the Apology are corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods that the city believes in. So we could say that both Falstaff and Socrates are threats to the political regime to a certain degree. That's why Socrates ends up being executed. Hal needed to learn from Falstaff, but there's no room for him in the political order, we could say. And the play seems to say that Henry V as a character is the closest thing we can imagine to the philosopher ruler, or at least the ruler educated by the philosopher. But perhaps this is a satire of the philosopher as such. The better educator of the political ruler is the poet. So maybe Shakespeare is continuing, we could say, in this, what Plato had called this old quarrel of philosophy and poetry. He calls it that in Book 10 of the Republic, which is the best source for educating the community and educating its leaders. Plato saying it's not the poets, it's not Homer, and Greek society had followed Homer, and it had been the Homer and the poets that had educated the community and its leaders. Plato saying it should be educated through rational thought and deliberation of the philosopher, Shakespeare, in a way, could be saying that, kind of a repost, the response of the on the poet's part to this quarrel of philosophy and poetry, kind of a counter argument to Plato there. We could say that Falstaff in Henry V represents the dangerous tendency to question assumptions, as does Socrates. And it's a tendency that society must forego if it's united in war, if it's to be united in war. So the philosophic capacity of questioning is exactly the type of faculty that needs to be suppressed in order to forge a myth around English rights in France, Salic laws, tennis balls, all that Henry's trying to forge into reasons for the whole country to get together and to go to war in France.